In the autumn skies above Germany during 1944, a seasoned Luftwaffe pilot guided his Focke-Wulf 190 through yet another intercept mission against American bomber formations targeting the industrial heartland. This particular aviator, having already shot down 2 heavy bombers that morning, checked his ammunition status and calculated he had enough rounds for perhaps one final engagement before returning to his airfield. At 24 years of age, he carried the weight of 5 years of nearly uninterrupted aerial combat on his shoulders. His record showed 204 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, a tally that spoke to both exceptional skill and remarkable fortune in surviving so long. Yet the exhaustion he felt transcended mere physical fatigue. It had become something deeper, a weariness that affected his reflexes, his decision-making processes, and even the mechanical way he maneuvered his aircraft through the sky. Every movement felt heavier than it should. Every decision took fractionally longer to make. As he positioned himself for an attack run on the bomber stream, he observed something that had become increasingly prevalent in recent months. The American fighter escorts, specifically the P-51 Mustang fighters, seemed to be everywhere at once. They no longer simply protected the bomber formations in a defensive posture. Instead, they aggressively sought out German interceptors, hunting them with methodical determination across wide areas of sky. What troubled him most was their consistent level of competence. These American pilots might not demonstrate the exceptional artistry that came from years of combat experience, but they showed a disturbing reliability in their basic skills and tactical awareness. One of these Mustang fighters suddenly turned toward him, initiating an engagement. The German pilot quickly assessed the American's approach vector, closure rate, and energy state. The enemy pilot committed no glaring tactical errors. His positioning fell within acceptable parameters. His energy management demonstrated sound understanding of fighter combat principles. Using every technique learned over 5 years of aerial warfare, the German forced his aircraft into a defensive spiral, attempting to create firing opportunities while denying them to his opponent. The American pilot maintained pursuit for several crucial seconds before breaking off the engagement, likely due to fuel or ammunition constraints rather than any tactical disadvantage. After safely returning to his airfield, the German pilot discovered that 3 aircraft from his squadron had failed to return. 2 experienced pilots had been killed in action. The third casualty was a 19-year-old who had joined the unit just 6 weeks earlier, with barely sufficient training to safely operate his aircraft. This young aviator had completed exactly 4 combat missions before his death. That evening, while gathered in the officers' quarters, the experienced German pilot discussed recent developments with another highly skilled aviator who had accumulated 176 confirmed victories. They talked about the patterns they were observing in aerial combat. The Americans appeared to possess an inexhaustible supply of aviators. While not brilliant by the standards of veteran German pilots, these American flyers demonstrated adequate proficiency. They understood their aircraft's capabilities, grasped fundamental tactical concepts, and most critically, they avoided the catastrophic mistakes that typically resulted in easy kills for experienced opponents. The other German pilot mentioned something he had learned from interrogating a captured American aviator. The American military rotated their combat pilots back to the United States after they completed a predetermined number of missions. For bomber crews, this might be 25 missions during certain periods, while fighter pilots sometimes flew 50 missions before rotation. Following completion of their combat tours, these aviators returned home, away from the fighting. To the German pilot, this concept seemed almost incomprehensible from a military standpoint. Why would any air force deliberately remove experienced combat pilots from frontline service? These were aviators who had survived long enough to truly master their craft, who had accumulated the kind of practical wisdom that kept them alive, who had become genuinely effective combat assets. The policy appeared wasteful and irrational, the sort of decision that reflected American material abundance rather than sound military doctrine. He could not have known that this seemingly inefficient rotation policy, the system that appeared to discard hard-earned experience, was actually creating a cumulative advantage that would ultimately prove insurmountable. Every American pilot sent home became an instructor. Each instructor subsequently trained dozens of new pilots. The mathematics underlying this system would produce results that no amount of individual heroism, regardless of how exceptional, could possibly match. The fundamental question that would perplex German fighter pilots throughout the remainder of the conflict was straightforward yet troubling. Where did all these American pilots originate? Why did the enemy never seem to run out of competent aviators? The answer was being constructed not in the combat zones over Europe, but rather in training facilities distributed across the continental United States. This answer represented a fundamental, philosophical difference in how two nations approached the challenge of aerial warfare. The Luftwaffe's methodology for developing fighter pilots was not arbitrary or haphazard. It rested on sound military reasoning that had demonstrated effectiveness during the war's early campaigns. German military theorists had carefully studied aerial combat from the First World War and had drawn specific conclusions about what created effective fighter pilots. Experience represented everything. Statistical analysis showed that a pilot who survived his first 5 combat missions had a reasonable probability of surviving 50 missions. A pilot who survived 50 missions might well survive 500. The learning curve was extraordinarily steep, brutally unforgiving, and written in the blood of those who failed to climb it quickly enough. However, once a pilot successfully navigated that curve, once he internalized the countless small decisions that separated life from death, he became exponentially more effective as a combat asset. The Luftwaffe identified these survivors and constructed its entire fighter force around them. They were termed experts. Pilots who had accumulated not merely victory tallies, but the profound understanding of aerial combat that emerged from prolonged exposure to mortal danger. These aviators understood energy management at an instinctive level. They could evaluate complex tactical situations in mere seconds. They knew their aircraft's performance, capabilities at the extreme edges of the flight envelope, because they had repeatedly operated at those edges and survived the experience. One particularly successful German pilot exemplified this system perfectly. Joining a fighter squadron on the Eastern Front in October 1942, his initial combat missions were catastrophic from a performance standpoint. He was shot down by Soviet aircraft. He nearly died from Soviet ground fire. He committed errors that would have proven fatal had not more experienced squadron members intervened. Yet he survived these early disasters and learned from them. By 1943, he was accumulating aerial victories at a rate that seemed statistically impossible. His final confirmed tally would reach 352 enemy aircraft destroyed, a number that remains unmatched by any pilot from any nation in any war. He achieved this extraordinary record by flying continuously, remaining in combat without rotation, never being sent away from the front lines. Another German pilot from the same squadron accumulated 301 confirmed victories. A third achieved 275. Yet another reached 267 victories before being killed in combat in February 1945. These were not statistical anomalies or outliers. The Luftwaffe had more than 100 pilots, who each accumulated over 100 confirmed aerial victories. The system that produced these remarkable results was built entirely on continuous combat exposure. German fighter pilots flew missions until they were killed, severely wounded, or captured by enemy forces. No rotation policy existed. No fixed number of missions existed after which a pilot could expect to return home to safety. You flew combat missions until you physically could no longer do so. This approach created a force with highly concentrated expertise. The top performers were extraordinarily capable, able to accomplish missions that seemed impossible to less experienced aviators. One of these expert pilots developed a tactical methodology that minimized his personal risk while maximizing his combat effectiveness. He would position his aircraft unseen by the enemy, close to within optimal firing range, take a single high-percentage shot at a vulnerable target, then immediately break away from the engagement area. This disciplined method kept him alive through over 1,400 combat missions, an almost unbelievable number of exposures to potentially lethal situations. The Luftwaffe system reflected broader German military culture and the specific strategic constraints Germany faced as a continental power surrounded by potential adversaries. The Wehrmacht had traditionally emphasized quality over quantity across all its forces. German military theorists maintained that superior training, better equipment, and tactical excellence could overcome numerical disadvantages. This philosophy had deep historical roots in Prussian and German military tradition. During the wars of German unification in the 1860s and 1870s, Prussian military forces had defeated larger Austrian and French armies through superior training, superior staff work, and operational excellence. The concept of the highly trained professional soldier who could accomplish what masses of poorly trained conscripts Could not was deeply embedded in German military thinking across all services. In the 1930s, as Germany rebuilt its military in deliberate violation of the Treaty of Versailles, the Luftwaffe adopted this quality-focused philosophy for its fighter arm. The goal was to create an elite corps of fighter pilots, men who would undergo extensive initial training and then remain in continuous combat until they achieved complete mastery of their craft. These expert pilots would form the core of the fighter force, providing leadership and achieving the kind of exceptional results that would multiply their individual impact far beyond what their numbers might suggest. The early years of the Second World War seem to completely validate this approach. During the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, German pilots of the Condor Legion gained invaluable combat experience while supporting nationalist forces against Republican forces. These veterans returned to Germany carrying practical knowledge of aerial combat that proved extremely valuable when full-scale war erupted across Europe. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Luftwaffe fighter pilots encountered Polish aircraft that were generally inferior in performance characteristics. Polish pilots fought with great courage and determination, but they were overwhelmed by superior German aircraft, and more critically, by more experienced German pilots who had combat experience from Spain. The campaign lasted only 5 weeks. The Luftwaffe established air superiority quickly and maintained it throughout the brief conflict. In May 1940, the invasion of France and the Low Countries again demonstrated Luftwaffe effectiveness against numerically significant opposition. French and British air forces possessed numerous aircraft and brave pilots, but they were defeated by superior German tactics and by the accumulated combat experience German pilots possessed. The Luftwaffe's fighter force dominated the skies over the battlefield, enabling the rapid German ground advance that led to France's surrender in approximately 6 weeks. These consecutive victories strongly reinforced German confidence in their pilot development system. The expert pilots were proving their strategic worth exactly as theory predicted. Individual pilots became national heroes, their victory tallies growing substantially with each campaign. The underlying logic seemed unassailable. Keep your best pilots in continuous combat. Allow them to accumulate experience and victories, and they would provide the fighter superiority Germany needed to achieve its strategic objectives. Even the Battle of Britain, fought from July through October 1940, did not fundamentally challenge this belief, despite representing a strategic German defeat. The Luftwaffe lost that campaign primarily due to strategic and operational errors at the highest levels of command, not because their pilot development system was fundamentally flawed. German fighter pilots continued achieving impressive individual victory tallies, even while the overall campaign ended in failure. The system itself seemed sound. While German pilots flew combat missions until death or capture, the United States Army Air Forces implemented a fundamentally different system. This difference was not immediately obvious to German commanders, and when they first learned of the American rotation policy, many dismissed it as simply another example of American inefficiency and wasteful use of resources. The American rotation policy evolved and adjusted throughout the war, but its core principle remained absolutely constant. Combat pilots would fly a specified number of missions, then rotate back to the continental United States for rest, recovery, and reassignment, often as flight instructors. For bomber crews in the 8th Air Force operating over Europe, the initial requirement was 25 combat missions. This was subsequently increased to 30 missions, then to 35 missions as the war progressed, and as improved tactics and better equipment increased overall survival rates. For fighter pilots, the requirements varied somewhat by theatre and time period. In the European theatre, fighter pilots initially flew 200 to 300 combat hours before rotation home. Later in the war, this shifted to specific mission counts, often around 50 combat missions. In the Pacific theatre, tour lengths were sometimes calculated in months rather than missions, typically 6 to 12 months of combat duty before rotation. The reasoning behind this policy was not immediately apparent even to many American commanders. The commanding general of the Army Air Forces faced criticism from some quarters that the rotation policy was removing experienced pilots from combat precisely when they were becoming most effective as combat assets. Why send home a pilot who had survived long enough to truly master his craft? The answer lay in a broader, more sophisticated understanding of industrial warfare and organizational learning. The American military, particularly the Army Air Forces, recognized that individual expertise, regardless of how exceptional it might be, could not overcome systemic advantages in pilot production and overall training. Quality of fighter pilot who completed a combat tour in North Africa before returning to the United States as an instructor later explained the system's underlying logic. A pilot who had survived 50 combat missions possessed knowledge that was extremely valuable from a military standpoint. However, that knowledge only created strategic value if it could be effectively transmitted to other pilots. One experienced pilot flying combat operations could perhaps achieve 2 or 3 aerial victories per mission if he was truly exceptional. That same pilot serving as an instructor for 6 months could train 50 new pilots, each of whom would be significantly more capable than they would have been without his instruction and guidance. The mathematics were genuinely compelling when examined objectively. 50 pilots, each even marginally more capable due to superior instruction, represented far more total combat power than one exceptional pilot, regardless of how skilled that individual might be. Furthermore, if each of those 50 pilots survived to complete their own combat tours and subsequently became instructors themselves, the multiplication effect became exponential rather than merely linear. The United States possessed the industrial capacity and geographic security necessary to implement this system on a massive scale. American training facilities were located in the continental United States, thousands of miles from any combat zone or potential enemy attack. Student pilots trained without any threat of enemy interference. Fuel was abundant and available without strict rationing. Aircraft were plentiful. If a student pilot damaged an aircraft during training, another aircraft was immediately available to continue the training program. The constraints that limited German training programs simply did not exist in the American context. The primary training facilities included installations that had been training aviators for decades before the war began. One facility in Florida had been training naval aviators since 1914. A major facility in Texas, often called the West Point of the Air, had opened in 1930 and became the primary training location for Army Air Force's pilots. Another facility in Texas began operations in 1941 and could train thousands of pilots simultaneously. Additional facilities in Arizona and dozens of other locations across the American South and Southwest produced pilots in numbers that would have seemed impossible to European observers, constrained by resource limitations. By 1943, the American pilot training program was producing over 100,000 pilots per year across all military services. This figure included not just fighter pilots, but bomber pilots, transport pilots, and all other aviation specialties. The scale was absolutely unprecedented in military history up to that point. Each training facility followed standardized curricula that had been developed and continuously refined by experienced combat pilots who had rotated home from combat zones. Students received approximately 200 hours of flight training before earning their pilot's wings. This training included basic flight instruction, instrument flying, formation flying, aerial gunnery, and tactical instruction. After earning their wings, fighter pilots received additional, specialized training in the specific aircraft type they would fly in combat operations. The American system created what would now be recognized as a virtuous cycle that German commanders failed to fully appreciate until circumstances made it impossible to ignore. Each combat veteran who rotated home brought current tactical knowledge directly back into the training pipeline. This knowledge was systematically incorporated into standardized training curricula, ensuring that new pilots learned from the actual experiences of those who had survived combat operations. One American pilot who flew Spitfires with the Royal Air Force before transferring to the United States Army Air Forces completed multiple combat tours. Between his combat deployments, he served as an instructor and helped develop tactical doctrine for a specific American fighter type. The lessons he taught, derived directly from his combat experience, were learned by hundreds of student pilots. Those pilots carried that knowledge into their own combat operations, where it kept them alive long enough to gain their own experience. Some of those pilots would eventually become instructors themselves, passing along what they had learned. This process created what modern military analysts would describe as institutional learning. The American military was learning as an organization, not merely as a collection of individuals. Each combat veteran who returned home represented a data point in a growing knowledge base. Their experiences, their successful tactics, their mistakes and near disasters all became part of a continuously expanding body of knowledge that was systematically taught to new pilots entering the training pipeline. The contrast with the German system became increasingly stark as the war progressed year by year. German expert pilots accumulated tremendous personal expertise that died with them when they were eventually killed in action. When a pilot with 200 aerial victories was shot down and killed, all of his knowledge, all of his hard-won tactical wisdom, was permanently lost to the Luftwaffe. The German military had no systematic method for capturing and transmitting this invaluable knowledge to new pilots entering operational service. By 1944, German fighter pilot training had been severely curtailed due to chronic fuel shortages and the pressing need to commit available aircraft to combat operations rather than training activities. New German pilots arrived at operational units with as little as 160 hours of total flight time, including all of their basic training. They had minimal aerial gunnery training, limited formation flying experience, and virtually no tactical instruction whatsoever. They were sent directly into combat against Allied pilots who had received twice as much training time and who had been taught by combat veterans with extensive operational experience. The results were tragically predictable. New German pilots were shot down at appalling rates that shocked even experienced commanders. On the Eastern Front, a new pilot's life expectancy was literally measured in individual missions rather than months of service. In the West, facing American and British pilots with superior training and overwhelming numerical superiority, survival rates were even lower. German ace pilots increasingly found themselves flying with wingmen who were dangerous liabilities rather than tactical assets. These inexperienced pilots required constant protection and supervision rather than providing mutual support in combat. One experienced German pilot, returning from a combat mission in November 1944, discovered that his assigned wingman, a 19-year-old with less than 200 total flight hours, had become separated from the formation and had not returned to base. The young pilot's aircraft was eventually found crashed 30 miles from the combat zone. Investigators determined that he had simply become disoriented during the mission and had run out of fuel while trying to find his way back to base. He had been killed by his own inexperience and inadequate training, not by direct enemy action. This pattern repeated itself thousands upon thousands of times across all fronts. The Luftwaffe was steadily bleeding experienced pilots who could not possibly be replaced at anything approaching the rate of loss. Each casualty represented not just a single pilot lost, but the complete elimination of years of accumulated knowledge and tactical wisdom. Meanwhile, the Americans were creating experienced pilots faster than they were losing them to combat attrition. The American advantage was not purely numerical, though sheer numbers mattered enormously in modern industrial warfare. The advantage was also qualitative in nature. By late 1944, the average American fighter pilot arriving in the European theater for his first combat tour had objectively better training than the average German fighter pilot he would face in combat. The American pilot had been trained by combat veterans who knew exactly what skills would be needed in actual combat. He had received extensive aerial gunnery training with adequate ammunition expenditure. He had practiced formation flying for hundreds of hours. He understood his aircraft thoroughly because he had flown it extensively during training. The German pilot arriving at an operational unit, by direct contrast, had received minimal training due to severe resource constraints. He had very little gunnery training because ammunition was strictly rationed. He had limited total flight time because fuel allocations for training had been repeatedly cut. He arrived at his operational unit as a distinct liability, someone who needed to be actively protected and taught by the few remaining experienced pilots who were themselves utterly exhausted from months or years of continuous combat operations. The raw numbers told a story that no amount of individual heroism could possibly overcome. In 1943, the United States graduated over 65,000 pilots from its various training programs across all services. Germany graduated approximately 15,000 pilots that same year. By 1944, as German resources became more constrained while American production simultaneously increased, the disparity grew even wider. American training facilities operated at scales that were genuinely difficult for European observers to comprehend, given their own resource limitations. At one naval facility alone, more than 35,000 pilots received training between 1941 and 1945. The facility covered over 2,000 acres and included multiple auxiliary airfields for different phases of training. At peak operation, it had over 700 aircraft assigned exclusively for training purposes. One civilian contract school in Arizona operated under military supervision. graduated more than 10,000 pilots during the war years. Another facility, also in Arizona, trained more than 12,000 pilots. These were merely individual facilities among dozens. The United States operated dozens of such training bases, each one producing hundreds or thousands of pilots annually. The industrial support infrastructure for this massive training program was equally impressive. The United States produced over 300,000 aircraft during the Second World War. A significant portion of these were training aircraft that existed solely to train pilots, never seeing combat operations. One basic trainer type saw more than 11,000 examples produced. An advanced trainer had more than 15,000 examples built for American and Allied use. These aircraft represented an enormous investment in human capital development that Germany could not possibly match given its strategic situation and resource constraints. German training programs suffered from exactly the opposite problem. As the war progressed and Germany's overall strategic situation deteriorated, fuel allocations for training purposes were cut repeatedly and drastically. By 1944, German training units received barely enough fuel to provide students with minimal flying hours to simply learn basic aircraft control. Advanced training, the specialized instruction that taught tactical skills and combat techniques, was largely eliminated entirely. New pilots were expected to learn these critical skills at operational units in the field, if they managed to survive long enough to learn them. The survival statistics reflected this enormous disparity in training quality and quantity. In 1944, a new American fighter pilot arriving in Europe for his first combat tour had approximately a 70% chance of surviving long enough to complete that tour and rotate back home. A new German fighter pilot arriving at an operational unit that same year had less than a 30% chance of surviving just 3 months. These stark differences were not matters of courage, determination, or willingness to sacrifice. German pilots fought with extraordinary bravery against absolutely overwhelming odds. The differences were matters of systems, of industrial capacity, of fundamental philosophical approaches to developing combat pilots. The American system created more pilots overall, better trained pilots individually, and crucially preserved the knowledge gained through combat by systematically rotating experienced pilots home to teach others. One supremely successful German pilot, still flying combat operations in early 1945 with 352 confirmed aerial victories, found himself leading formations that included multiple new pilots with less than 50 hours of experience in the aircraft type they were flying. He had to devote most of his attention and energy to keeping these inexperienced pilots alive, which severely limited his own effectiveness as a combat pilot. After one particularly difficult mission, he wrote in his personal diary that he felt less like a fighter pilot and more like a flight instructor conducting training exercises under actual combat conditions. The irony, which he may not have fully appreciated at the time, was that American flight instructors were doing exactly that same thing, conducting training with student pilots, but they were doing it safely in the continental United States with adequate fuel supplies, sufficient aircraft, and enough time to properly prepare their students for the realities of combat operations. By January 1945, the mathematical consequences of these fundamentally different systems had become utterly impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe's fighter force was collapsing, not primarily from lack of aircraft, though that was increasingly becoming a problem, but from a critical shortage of adequately trained pilots to effectively fly them. German factories continued producing fighter aircraft, despite Allied strategic bombing. In some months, production numbers actually increased. However, there simply were not enough qualified pilots available to fly these aircraft. With any real effectiveness, a massive operation, launched on the first day of January 1945, demonstrated this crisis with brutal clarity. The operation was an enormous strike against Allied airfields in Belgium, Holland, and France, involving over 900 Luftwaffe aircraft. It represented one of the largest single-day commitments of German air power in the entire war. The strategic goal was to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground, particularly the tactical fighters that were providing close support to Allied ground forces. The attack achieved some immediate tactical success. Nearly 300 Allied aircraft were destroyed or damaged while on the ground. Several airfields were temporarily rendered inoperative. However, the cost to the Luftwaffe was absolutely catastrophic and strategically disastrous. More than 270 German aircraft were lost in the operation. Most critically, more than 230 German pilots were killed or captured. These were not simply any pilots. Many were experienced formation leaders, men with hundreds of missions and dozens of victories, men whose loss could not possibly be replaced. One experienced German pilot survived this massive operation, but he lost 4 pilots from his unit. 2 were killed in action. 2 were captured after being shot down over Allied-controlled territory. One of the dead pilots had accumulated 96 confirmed victories. His knowledge, his tactical expertise, his years of combat experience, all died permanently with him. The Luftwaffe possessed no system whatsoever to preserve what he had learned. No mechanism to pass his hard-won wisdom to the next generation of pilots entering operational service. The Americans, by direct contrast, could absorb losses that would have been absolutely crippling to Germany's pilot force. When an experienced American pilot was shot down and killed, his knowledge was not lost because he had already transmitted it to others before deploying to combat. Before his combat deployment, he had been trained by instructors who were themselves combat veterans. When he completed his tour and rotated home, he would have become an instructor himself, teaching new pilots the lessons he had learned through his own experiences. Even his eventual death represented the loss of one experienced pilot, not the permanent loss of all the accumulated knowledge he possessed. After this massive operation, the Luftwaffe never recovered its effectiveness. Fuel shortages became progressively more severe as Allied ground advances cut Germany off from oil supplies in Romania and as synthetic fuel production plants were systematically destroyed by strategic bombing. The few remaining experienced pilots flew progressively fewer missions because fuel simply was not available for operations. New pilots continued arriving with training that was barely adequate for them to safely take off and land, much less engage in effective combat against experienced opponents. In February 1945, the commander of a jet fighter unit equipped with the revolutionary new jet fighter wrote extensively in his diary about the deteriorating situation. He personally had 176 confirmed victories and was an extremely experienced combat leader. However, he was leading a unit where most of his pilots had never flown a jet aircraft before being assigned to his squadron. They were learning to fly revolutionary new technology while simultaneously trying to learn combat tactics against an enemy that possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. The jet fighter itself was a truly remarkable aircraft. The world's first operational jet fighter, capable of speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour. It was significantly faster than any Allied fighter aircraft. Its heavy cannon armament could destroy a bomber with a single accurate burst. However, it was also extremely difficult to fly, required very long runways for operations, and was highly maintenance intensive. Assigning such an advanced and demanding aircraft to pilots with minimal training was effectively asking for disaster. On March 18, 1945, this highly experienced German commander was himself severely burned when his jet fighter crashed during takeoff. The accident was caused by a mechanical tire failure, but the commander later reflected that extreme fatigue from months of continuous operations had significantly slowed his reactions. An experienced pilot in optimal physical and mental condition might have been able to save the aircraft. He survived his injuries, but his combat flying career was permanently over. Yet another highly experienced pilot had been removed from combat, his accumulated knowledge no longer available to the Luftwaffe. While Germany's pilot force collapsed, the American system continued producing dividends that extended far beyond the immediate combat situation. The pilots who rotated home after completing their combat tours did not simply become instructors and then disappear from history. Many of them became the foundational leadership of American military aviation for decades following the war's conclusion. One pilot completed his first combat tour in Europe with 28 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the top American ace pilots. He rotated home, served a period as an instructor, then returned for a second combat tour. After the war ended, he remained in the newly independent United States Air Force. During the Korean War, he flew jet fighters and achieved 6.5 additional victories, making him one of only 7 American pilots to achieve ace status in 2 separate wars. He eventually retired at a senior rank in 1967, having served as a senior officer and passed on his accumulated knowledge through multiple generations of pilots. Another successful pilot completed a combat tour in Europe with 27 confirmed victories. He rotated home, served briefly as a test pilot and instructor, then left active military service after the war ended. However, his knowledge and experience continued to influence American aviation development. He wrote extensively about air combat tactics, consulted for the Air Force on tactical matters, and helped train new generations of fighter pilots through his published writings and lectures. His book, published more than a decade after the war, became required reading at Air Force, training facilities, and influenced tactical development for years. 1. Pilot who achieved 38 confirmed victories. In the Pacific Theater was tragically killed in action in January 1945 during what would have been his final combat tour before rotation home. However, before his death, he had already contributed substantially to the training program. During a brief period in the United States between combat deployments, he spent 2 months at a training facility, sharing his tactical knowledge and combat experiences with student pilots. Those students carried his lessons into their own combat operations. Some of them survived the war and became instructors themselves, passing along what they had learned from him. This multiplication effect, this geometric expansion of knowledge and expertise, was precisely what the American system had been deliberately designed to achieve. Each combat veteran who rotated home created dozens of more capable pilots through his instruction. Each of those pilots, if they survived to complete their own tours, could themselves become instructors and create dozens more well-trained pilots. The system was genuinely exponential in its cumulative impact over time. The institutional knowledge that steadily accumulated in American training facilities represented a strategic asset whose true value was extremely difficult to quantify but absolutely impossible to overstate. By 1945, American training curricula systematically incorporated lessons derived from hundreds of thousands of individual combat missions. Student pilots learned from the collective experience of every American pilot who had completed a tour and returned home to share what they had learned. They learned which tactics worked consistently and which did not. They learned which tactical approaches kept you alive and which ones got you killed. They learned from mistakes that other pilots had made and survived to report and analyze. German pilots, by direct contrast, learned primarily from their own personal mistakes, if they survived those mistakes long enough to learn from them. New German pilots arrived at operational field units with minimal training and absolutely no exposure to the accumulated knowledge of combat veterans, because those veterans were still flying combat missions, exhausted and increasingly desperate until they were finally killed or the war ended. The statistical impact of this systemic difference was clearly measurable in combat results. In the final months of the European War, American fighter pilots were achieving kill ratios consistently exceeding 5-1 against German aircraft. This was not because American pilots were inherently superior as individuals, or because American aircraft were overwhelmingly better in performance, though American numerical superiority certainly contributed significantly. The advantage existed because American pilots were systematically better trained, had been taught by combat veterans, understood their aircraft thoroughly, and had learned tactics that maximized their inherent advantages while minimizing their vulnerabilities. When the war in Europe officially ended in May 1945, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The most successful German pilot, with his record 352 victories, surrendered to American forces, who subsequently turned him over to Soviet forces. He spent 10 years in extremely harsh Soviet captivity, not returning to Germany until 1955. Another highly successful pilot, with 301 victories, survived the war and later joined the reformed post-war West German Luftwaffe, serving until the mid-1970s. Another highly experienced pilot survived 404 combat missions and 220 confirmed victories, making him one of the very few top German aces to survive the entire war. These men were genuinely extraordinarily skilled pilots, who had achieved results that seemed statistically impossible. However, their remarkable individual excellence could not overcome the fundamental systemic advantages their opponents possessed through superior training infrastructure and retention of institutional knowledge. After the war concluded, several surviving German ace pilots acknowledged this reality in interviews and published memoirs. One stated explicitly that by 1944 he knew with certainty that Germany had lost the air war, not because German pilots lacked courage or individual skill, but because the mathematics of the situation were absolutely insurmountable. The American rotation policy, which had initially seemed wasteful and inefficient to German observers, had systematically created a force that was both quantitatively and qualitatively superior. The United States ended the war with thousands of trained pilots in service, extensive training facilities operating at high capacity, and a vast institutional knowledge base that would support American military aviation for many decades to come. The Luftwaffe ended the war with only a handful of surviving ace pilots, completely destroyed training infrastructure, and no systematic method whatsoever to preserve or effectively transmit the knowledge that had been gained through 6 years of intensive combat operations. Post-war analysis, conducted by American and British military historians, definitively confirmed what had become apparent during the war's final year. The rotation policy was not primarily a humanitarian gesture or a morale-building exercise, though it effectively served both those purposes. It was fundamentally a force multiplier of enormous strategic significance. By systematically rotating experienced pilots home to become instructors, the United States had created a training pipeline that produced new pilots faster than they could possibly be lost in combat operations, and critically ensured that each successive generation of new pilots was better trained than their predecessors. The German expert pilot system, by direct contrast, concentrated expertise in exceptional individuals whose accumulated knowledge died permanently with them when they were killed. It created impressive individual records and remarkable personal achievements, but it completely failed to build sustainable institutional capacity. When those expert pilots were inevitably lost to combat attrition, their irreplaceable knowledge was lost along with them, and the system possessed no effective mechanism to replace either the pilots themselves or their expertise. The fundamental lessons learned extended far beyond World War II itself. The United States applied conceptually similar rotation policies during the Korean War conflict and, with various modifications, during the Vietnam War. The core principle remained constant across decades. Individual expertise is tactically valuable, but institutional knowledge represents strategic advantage. A military force that systematically captures and effectively transmits combat experience through its training pipeline creates cumulative advantages that individual heroism, regardless of how exceptional, simply cannot overcome through personal achievement alone. For the German ace pilots who survived the war, there existed a bitter recognition of what might have been possible under different circumstances. If Germany had possessed the industrial capacity and strategic geographic depth necessary to implement a rotation policy similar to America's approach, if German training facilities could have operated safely thousands of miles from any combat zone, if adequate fuel and aircraft had been available for extensive training programs, the air war might have progressed very differently. However, Germany never possessed these fundamental advantages, and the expert pilot system, for all its creation of individual excellence and remarkable personal achievements, could not possibly compensate for fundamental strategic disadvantages and resource constraints. The story that began with one experienced German pilot's confusion and bewilderment over the American rotation policy ended with a much broader truth about the nature of modern industrial warfare. Individual skill matters significantly. Training quality matters greatly. Equipment performance matters considerably. However, underlying systems matter most of all. The side that constructs superior systems for developing, preserving, and effectively transmitting expertise creates cumulative advantages that steadily accumulate over time until they become completely overwhelming and insurmountable. The American rotation policy represented exactly such a system, and its ultimate success demonstrated a principle that remains valid in modern military contexts. In contemporary warfare, the nation that treats human capital development as systematically and carefully as it treats material resources and industrial production gains profound advantages that individual heroism and personal courage, no matter how exceptional and inspiring, simply cannot overcome through individual achievement alone. The mathematics of systematic institutional learning will always, eventually, overwhelm even the most exceptional individual performance when sustained over sufficient time periods.